Excellent. Thank you very much, Camille. Welcome back, everyone. So I'm very pleased to be joined by said esteemed colleagues this morning. So we've got Daniel Mayo, who's our Director of IT Data Tools. I'm very pleased to have Aditya Kaul with us. Aditya is Research Director at Tractica. You may have noticed a couple of references earlier today to Tractica being a recent acquisition for Informa, specialising in artificial intelligence. So we're very pleased to have a new colleague with us. And then Kieran Hines, who's our Head of Industries Research at Ovum. So as some of you may know, we're, for the first time, combining this year the Digital Futures event with our long-running Ovum Industry Congress. So we thought it would be interesting at this point to look at some of the enterprise adoption patterns for emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, and really drill down a little bit with these expert folks here, just to talk a little bit about the patterns that we're seeing. So one of the sort of key research programs that we have in this area is what we term our ICT Enterprise Insights. And Daniel is the key man responsible for that. So we're going to start with Daniel telling us a little bit about the program, and we've got some data sort of hot off the press, as it were, for this year's survey to tell us what the patterns are showing. I'll just pick up the clicker there. Shall I put the first one?
Well, shall I just introduce the study quickly? So very good timing, actually, because we literally finished the study last week, so busy weekend putting some initial findings together. The study itself, it's a large-scale primary research program with enterprises. We've spoken to over 6,500 enterprises. That's across 60 different countries and across a number of industries. The focus was speaking with the senior ICT decision makers, people with responsibility both for the projects, prioritization and the overall budgets. And the focus was to get a feel for where the budgets were going, where is the investment really over the next 18 months. A big focus was really around digital transformation, the impact of the digital trends we've been discussing. And one of the areas we did probe was around some key emerging technologies. So if you can show this first slide. So this was a question in regards to digital transformation. We asked them kind of what are your plans around using these digitally enabling technologies over the next 12 months. This is a question we also repeated last year. And what we're showing here is on the x-axis, this is the proportion of respondents of the 6,500 who said they had an active interest in this technology. So this is basically they have active plans to use them. They are actually trialing the technology, but not necessarily actually actively deploying it. On the x-axis, what we have is the proportion that are actually actively deploying the technology, and this would be in an operational kind of context. So a couple of kind of key things. One is actually for most of these emerging technologies, there is quite strong active interest, and you can see the movement over 2017 to this year has been quite significant there. The deployment status, this is actual kind of live deployment in the field, is actually generally far lower. Most of these technologies are still quite nascent, but kind of two key things. One is kind of big data out of this grouping is probably the most mature particularly in terms of adoption. But kind of mirroring the theme of this conference, artificial intelligence was the one that we've really seen the strongest movement, both particularly of the kind of active interest in the technology, but also in terms of institutions that are still deploying it.
Okay, that's great. Good view. So Aditya, how do you see when you're talking to enterprises? Does this mirror the sort of conversations you're having? How are people using those enabling technologies?
Yes, thank you, Tim. And it's great to be part of Informa and with you here on the stage. Right. So with regards to this result, I think it's interesting to see both AI and blockchain kind of be the largest movers, I guess, compared to last year. And these are two technologies that we cover as well within Tractica. One thing which is interesting is blockchain seems to be a bit higher than AI in terms of adoption. If you look at the x-axis, or sorry, the y-axis, which is interesting. Maybe that is a factor of maybe financial institutions.
Yes, so we had quite a strong focus on financial services in the sector.
Yeah, so yeah, but generally I think it sort of follows the same sort of trends we're seeing, where AI there's a lot of interest, but in terms of deployment, is still very early stages. And we can definitely talk about where we're seeing which use cases we're seeing deployment and which industries we're seeing it in. The other thing to point out is big data, kind of possibly being a leading indicator of how companies are thinking about AI. So as they go through the digital transformation, they plan ahead. So in order to implement AI, you need to have big data infrastructure in place, because without that, you really can't implement it. And as we saw today morning with Chima's talk, they first thought about the whole data infrastructure and then sort of started to roll out AI. So I think those are all sort of rhyming and syncing with what we're seeing.
Good. And Kieran, are you sensing a real sort of step forward? Are people really trying to leverage these things more effectively now?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to comment on the data, I suppose one important thing from the point of view of an industry's perspective is that this viewpoint, I think, holds very well in aggregates, but obviously there are some important differences to be aware of, and that exist at individual vertical level, and then that's very much what our team focuses on. And so looking at the importance of APIs and how that's changed, I think here we're capturing probably two things. One is growth in the use of APIs within a sort of architectural framework perspective, but also in verticals like retail banking, for example, where regulatory-driven initiatives around open API interfaces for third parties have become a very big part of the industry, both particularly in Europe and the UK, but also kind of increasingly on a global basis. So that's a very, very important area. I think something we're going to see becoming may well ripple through other sectors over time. IoT actually is also very interesting. So I think I know when we first saw this, we were expecting to see that perhaps in a different place to where it is there. And I guess that again reflects some important differences at vertical level about where IoT and chiefly, I suppose, the data that you then derive from IoT programs is playing different roles in different sectors. So in the insurance space, for example, of course, IoT and particularly the ability to price for risk based on usage, using things like in-car telemetry in the auto sector, very, very important. And likewise in the utility space too, of course, evolutions of the grid and so on also driving a lot of interest in that area. And the final area is blockchain, actually. I think, I suppose here, as Aditya pointed out extremely well, again, this is something you may expect to have seen in a different place, particularly given the potentially absurd amounts of hype that have been around this over the past 18 months or so. And as an aside, if anyone's curious, if you want to plot Google mentions against the Bitcoin against the price of Bitcoin, it tracks almost perfectly. The drop-off in value maps onto the decline in consumer interest. I think with blockchain and distributed ledger technology more widely, we're moving into a space where the conversation is turning towards how you can actually take things out of the lab and from POC into in production, which is very challenging for lots of reasons, but also I think that the awareness of the role that will play as an enabling technology in improving existing ecosystems, things like trade flows, trade finance, logistics, for example, all very, very important there.
So you mentioned, Kieran, that there are different industry nuances to this. So Daniel, should we drill down now into some of the industry views that we've got from the data?
Indeed. So if you can show the next slide. So the actual study covers 12 key industries, and within that we cover 40 lines of business within that. There have been rather a lot to show on this slide. So we've actually grouped a couple of kind of super industries. So we've got financial services. So this is retail banking, insurance, capital markets, kind of buy side, sell side, corporate banking. We've got public services, which is kind of government, education, healthcare, and telecoms and media, which is telecoms and media. So this is the same chart as you saw previously in terms of the axes, but we've just focused on kind of big data and artificial intelligence because they were significant movers last year. And you can see actually at an industry level some quite clear differences by industry, and this is even when you go down to specific industries like retail banking or financial markets, you'll get another set of variation again. So big data, perhaps unsurprisingly given, I guess, the history of using analytics in financial services is unsurprisingly kind of very one of the most highest adoption rates. But interestingly, artificial intelligence, a lot of the interest is particularly strong, and this is in both the telecoms and the media sectors. Public services, I would say, kind of behind the other commercial sectors, which is often the case with kind of emerging technologies in terms of actual deployment. But actually, the actual interest in these technologies is still kind of is in the 55 to 60%. So actually still quite strong interest in that. What I would say is actually, interest is one thing, is actually understanding the use cases and where are enterprises thinking about using AI or big data is actually really where it gets really interesting. And actually, Tim, if you could just show the next slide. What we asked the respondents here is of a list of around kind of 10 to 50 different areas. Where were the key areas they were looking to deploy artificial and technologies within the next kind of 18 months, and this is covering the gamut of AI, so kind of natural language processing, machine learning, etc. So fairly broad, but you can see actually typically focus on the kind of customer segments, so digital banking, customer-facing operations on the service provider side, citizen-type services on the government, or particularly on the operations side, driving more efficiency initiatives. And actually on the service provider side, I think we're starting to see some more kind of specific use cases for AI emerging.
Yeah, great. Aditya, I know that Tractica sort of bases some of its methodology around use cases, so it'd be good to hear a little bit more about that and what do you see in the telecoms and media world?
So we've built essentially a taxonomy of use cases, about 300 or so use cases across 30 different industries. And we've been doing that over the last 3 years. So we've now got a pretty good sense of what the use cases are, how mature they are, what's coming next. And that kind of forms the basis or the foundation of our forecasting model. So we basically take each use case and try and find the addressable market for that and how AI is going to play a role within each use case. So we essentially then fold it up, and then we get a bigger picture of where AI is going, how is it being adopted across these different use cases, across different organizations, in the different industries. So in terms of, I think, if we saw on the last slide, we see a spectrum of industry, obviously. So telecom is on, we agree that it's on the leading edge. I think that's where we definitely see similarities. Public services, is kind of at the lower end. There's slight difference on the public service side. I'll just add there that we're seeing, for example, within public services, it's not listed here in terms of use cases, but in China, I mean, it's not surprising that they're investing a lot on video surveillance. So with regards to surveillance technologies, that is possibly one of the leading use cases that we see, at least on the government side, public services side, and that is, again, very much constrained to surveillance, as I said. Other than that, governments are slightly slower to adopt, and that's not very surprising. I think it's also a factor of how much of a threat you are in. So what sort of disruptions are occurring in your industry? I think in the morning there was a very good talk from Richard Murney about how disruptions are coming for telecom space. You're seeing some similar stuff happening in financial services, with sort of new young startups come up with sort of competitive sort of mobile-based services. So I think as industries start to face these disruptions, they will see AI as a tool to enable them to start to compete. So I think telecom is definitely at the front end, using financial services. In terms of use cases, maybe I'll just pick on the telecoms sector. So again, in terms of why telecom companies are investing in it, and this is nothing new. We've seen actually telecom. I mean, in the morning, BT said that they've been using it for 25 years. So this is not something new. It's not happened overnight. They've been using it for fall prediction, for optimizing networks. Actually, in our use cases across the 300 use cases, network optimization is actually our top use case across all 300. It's very, very interesting. Or actually, not the top 3 use cases. It actually, within the telecoms sector, we see it accounting for about $7.5 billion by 2025 in terms of the overall spend. So it's going to be a large part of the CapEx. And you're seeing, apart from, essentially, just to summarize, telecom companies, the carriers are essentially using AI, internally to improve the network, to optimize the network. Secondly, they're using it for customer-facing operations. I think, again, there was a great panel earlier today, but not just customer-facing operations. We're seeing it being applied in CRM kind of situations where you're seeing sales teams start to use AI to do predictive sales, not just using CRM data, but using social media data, weather data, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of interesting, innovative applications of AI within customer operations as well.
Great.
Just a few of them.
And Kieran, you do a lot of work in the financial services world. How about the retail banking use cases?
Yes, thank you. Just a quick word on the service provider piece as well, because we have a very strong service provider technology group within Ovum as well. And I mean, again, just to echo Aditya's points, I think the importance of AI and advanced analytics, particularly around the network and so on, is extremely important. And I know SK Telecom recently augmented their OSS system with a whole series of different AI technologies in order to improve a number of features from the customer side as well as network optimization. And another point here is that, of course, when we think about what's happening with 5G and the future of the network, then that's obviously going to be an accelerator for the use cases and needs for AI, particularly when it comes to things like network slicing and so on, as that kind of shapes, enables a whole range of different use cases on that new network infrastructure. In the banking space, I think it's an interesting area because as we've already had mentioned, the concept of analytics and AI have been a big part of banking for many years. In fact, if you talk to somebody who works in fraud detection in a bank, they'll sort of say, "Oh, what are you doing with these areas?" They turn around and say, "Oh, well, we've been doing this for 15 years, or we're calling it artificial intelligence now," which is interesting. And so, fraud detection, financial crime, prevention, and those kind of things, very key use cases for some of these technologies, particularly machine learning, of course. And in other areas, digital banking, we see huge amounts of development around personalization, using analytics of transaction data to better target and position services and so on. And these are just a couple of very tip of the iceberg kind of examples. Quick word on government as well. I think the interesting thing here, if you look above, there's for service provider and banking, there's a mixture of use cases which are around service enhancements, revenue driving, and efficiency, which is obviously quite sensible. In the case of government, of course, a very different sector, and all of those 3 categories are all driven, of course, by the need to largely increase efficiency and lower taxpayer costs, I suppose, in service delivery. And governments, of course, have no shortage of data. The imperatives here, of course, are very much around self-service, enabling better digital service delivery. The most advanced are the ones that are looking to stitch together data sources from different agencies and departments to drive better policy forming, as well actually as superior outcomes. And there's a huge amount of scope for improvements in many of those areas.
I guess sort of building the platform, as Seamus described this morning, is a lot more difficult in the public sector.
Absolutely.
Daniel, I just want to come back to you on digital banking. I know that you've been doing a project, one of our decision matrix projects in that area. Is artificial intelligence really starting to make a difference and change the customer experience there?
So there's 2 key areas here. So one is around the kind of whole chatbot, and actually this is very kind of in vogue at the moment. A lot of, particularly the larger banks, are rolling out chatbot-based services. within the kind of online channel in particular, but also increasingly in the mobile. The idea here really being about is something kind of innovative to show to clients, but also to kind of remove traffic from the kind of contact center, which is a kind of key pain point. But the other area, kind of mirroring what Kieran was saying, is actually around providing more personalization and analytics, particularly around personal financial management. Banks are being forced to kind of be more responsible in terms of helping kind of customers actually manage their money, and actually AI is a really good thing in terms of kind of what is your cash flow for the rest of the month, kind of what is your spending, and providing those additional kind of more value-added services that were traditionally been more on the kind of corporate banking side of things.
Great. Well, look, thank you very much, gents. That's been some good insights. I think, as you can tell, there's a wealth of data in the ICT Enterprise Insights Survey. So please do come and talk to us during the remainder of the day. And I think this enterprise perspective will be a good lead-in to the next two sessions, looking at AI maturity and then looking at some of the enterprise sort of adoption for AI. So please give a warm hand to our panelists. Thank you.